my voice, so it's better if I use a microphone, okay? Don't want you to...
I will do a brief introduction.
Yeah,
okay.
Okay. The audience and so on.
Actually, we did invite her once, but she didn't come. Okay, so I have to explain. I'm actually quite fortunate. It's quite fortunate we can invite Kristina Kironska here, because she was the one that contacted me, and it just happened that I was organizing a workshop on Belt and Road Initiative, and she actually had a paper because she was working on Burma and Chinese relations. Unfortunately, she couldn't come. I think she had some engagement in Philippines, probably on the beach somewhere. More important, of course.
Yeah, on the way.
Yeah. So actually, in addition to today's talk, if you have questions about her paper, we can always ask her. She did do research on Burma and in relation to Belt and Road, but of course that was just by accident that she had her main research is actually on Myanmar, and she worked among the Rohingya. Her current affiliation, I suppose, is Institute or Center of Asian Studies of Slovakia. She's originally from Slovakia. But she does have, in addition to her professional affiliation, she does have a very diverse work experience. She did work with Amnesty International. She's well connected with many government groups and so on and so forth. But her main research was in Myanmar. Actually, she did her. Was that your topic of your PhD research? She did her PhD actually at Zhongshan Daxue, Kaohsiung. And in addition, she also actually, in addition to Slovakia, her postgraduate research was in Portugal and in Taiwan. And she speaks more than 7 languages. So I was going to ask you, how is it that you know German and Hungarian?
German mom, Hungarian father.
That's the easy answer.
Yeah.
So if you add on all the other languages, so she's very well traveled and very. I'm quite sure we can ask her anything about anything. So, but it is true that she did work among the Rohingya, and there are many people who are very interested in this topic. And if you've been following the news, it's obviously something of current interest. So, please, welcome.
Okay, so thank you very much for having me. Thank you for the great introduction. So I came here today to talk to you about the conflict in Rakhine State. I will also introduce a little bit about Myanmar, the politics, and to give you a broader picture. Okay, so you know already everything about me, so I don't think I need to add much to it. So yes, I studied at the Zhongshan Daxue in Kaohsiung. I left in 2014. After that, I lived in Myanmar for almost 2 years. I did some research, and I also worked for a local NGO. After that, went to Slovakia, where I worked for Amnesty International, at the same time being active at the Central European Institute of Asian Studies, where we have a common friend, Richard. And this year I came back to Taiwan, part of the Taiwan Fellowship, and I was working again on things related to Myanmar, this time Taiwan-Myanmar relations. So, before we start, I brought you... This one is from Amnesty International. It's about refugees, and there is also a chapter on the Rohingya. So you can take a look, and maybe Monica, if you want, you can keep it.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So what do you think? How many refugees are there globally in the whole world? What's the number? What do you think? 10 million or 50 million?
you get a choice?
No. So it's something in between. It's 20.9 million refugees globally. So that's a very, very big number, unfortunately. 80% of these refugees are hosted in developing regions. Now, what do you think? What are the world's top 10 refugee host countries? Mm-hmm.
Bangladesh.
Yes. Yeah, then it's Germany, Sudan, Lebanon, Turkey, Ethiopia, Jordan, Pakistan. So I can pass this one, a little map. Okay, and I have one more question for you. What do you think? Which country hosts the most refugees per inhabitants? I think this is an unexpected one. It's Lebanon with 156 refugees per 100,000 inhabitants. So I can pass this too. So this is based on Amnesty International's research. And let me tell you, at Amnesty, when speaking about refugees, we like to use different words. We like to call them people on the move. Okay, so I want to start with a quote from the former president of Czechoslovakia, and after the split of the two countries, the first president of the Czech Republic. Every human suffering concerns every human being. So just very recently I went to a conference where I spoke about my newest paper, which is on a textual analysis of the state-owned media in Myanmar. And it was very interesting that after my presentation, several people came up to me and they asked me how come I am concerned with this thing and whether I am Muslim. So so that's why I like to start my talk with this quote, because I don't think you need to be Muslim or anything else to care about other people. So, in international law, a stateless person is not considered a national by any state under operation of its law. Yeah. And there was actually a campaign in 2014 launched by the UNHCR to end statelessness within the next 10 years. Well, so we have a lot of work to do. That's quite soon. So, and based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we all have a right to a nationality. We all have the right to belong to a country. And yet, there are as many as 10 million stateless people around the world. So let me give you some example of stateless people in Asia. It's the ethnic Nepalese in Bhutan. It's the Tamils in Sri Lanka. We just talked a little bit about it with Monica. It's the Biharis in Bangladesh, and today the focus will be on the Rohingya in Myanmar. So when speaking about the Rohingya, I want you to keep in mind 3 years, 2012, 16 and 17. This doesn't mean that there were no problems before these years. It's actually for many decades that the Rohingya have lived in a system of, we can call it a system of apartheid. They were not able to move around freely. They had problems of accessing education, marriage, childbirth, employment, and so on. But in 2012, there has been an anti-Muslim violence, and I'll talk about it a little more in detail in some of the next slides. This is just a quick overview. So in 2012, it resulted in 200,000 people fleeing. Then in 2016, we have ARSA, the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, that attacked police outposts and killed policemen, which triggered the clearance operation from the Myanmar military. Similar to 2017, again, we have those ARSA attacks with an even bigger response, a clearance operation where the military did not distinguish between civilians and militants, resulting in more than 700,000 Rohingya men, women and children fleeing to neighboring Bangladesh. So before people fled, there were only about 40,000 people, Rohingya people, who had citizenship. All of the other people, most of them were stateless. And in my slide you can see I compare this to the Chinese, because Myanmar has a lot of Chinese migrants. They are able to buy citizenship. Of course it's not legal, but apparently there's many 100,000 of people who were able to buy citizenship. This is just to put it in contrast to the Rohingya. And so why are we talking about this? This is a big crisis that is threatening Myanmar's stability, the stability of Bangladesh, but with that also the region as a whole. Let me show you a map. So here we have Myanmar with neighboring Bangladesh, and the gray part is what we will talk about today, which is the Rakhine State. You will hear me say Burma, Myanmar, Burmese, and that's because, of course, sometimes I make a mistake, but usually I try to use the name Burma for before 1989 and Myanmar after this year, and I use the adjective Burmese because I find it difficult to pronounce Myanmarese. So that's my choice, yeah, that's the only reason. Alright, so let me give you some background on Myanmar. So there's more than 50 million inhabitants, out of which 2 million are actually ethnic Chinese. You have lots of ethnic groups, as many as 135 officially. The majority population is called Burman. Yeah, so this is actually where the name Burma came from. So yeah, Burmese and Burman is slightly different. Then you have the Shans, Karens, the Rakhines, and so on. There's more than 100 languages, and the predominant religion is Buddhism. You can find also Christians and Muslims. I found the number 4%, but I really believe it's more than 4%. Let me give you a very quick background on Myanmar politics. So the country was a British colony until 1948, and after that, after a brief period of young democracy, there was a coup, and after that there were many decades of military dictatorship under various names. You might have heard of two dictators. One was Ne Win, and after that it was Tan Shwe. So in 2010 and 11 we see a change to the whole system. It's a top-down system, and suddenly we have the first elections in 2010, second elections in 2015, and the so-called democratization. I don't like to use that word, so let's just say a political transition. When it comes to the economy, so Burma was printing money endlessly to finance its political goals, and this controlled inflation and also demonetization. So we had three big ones in 64, 85 and 87. And demonetization means, now imagine how many 100 NT bills you have in your wallet. Suddenly they would be invalid. And only the 500 and the 1000 bills that you have, only those are valid, for example. So you would lose certainly some money. And back then people didn't keep their money in bank accounts like we do today. In 1987 the country was declared one of the least developed nations, and actually the country was lobbying for getting this status because it had an unusually high literacy rate for an LDN country. But then after a few years of lobbying, the status was achieved. And why the country wanted to have this status, that's because of certain funds coming in from other countries and other organizations. Then in 2010 and 11, with the political transition, of course we also have a liberalization. Again, I want to emphasize it's a top-down process. So people lived in people lived for many years in an autocratic regime, which doesn't mean they were happy with what was going on in their country. You actually had lots and lots of student demonstrations, and then two bigger uprisings that you may have heard of, the 8888 uprising in 1988, and then in 2007 the Saffron Revolution, which had a lot of monks participating. But this is not the focus of today's talk. This is just to show you that people were not happy with the system they had, but these uprisings were always crushed and they were always very bloody. So Myanmar is one of the world's youngest experiments with democracy, and reforms started in 2011 when the military junta succumbed to certain pressure and the military rule was dismantled, and in its place we see a so-called civilian government. So in 1948 we have independence, in 1962 the military coup and the start of the military regime, and then in 2011, that was the year when Aung San Suu Kyi, today's de facto leader, was released from house arrest, and political reforms were started by President Thein Sein, who actually was a general before, and then in 2010 he changed clothes, so from a uniform to civilian clothes. He ran for election, his party ran for election, and then he became president. So under this new president, exiles were welcome back. He removed about 2,000 names from the blacklist. Has any of you seen the movie The Lady?
Yeah.
So the main actress there, Michelle, she was one of the people on the blacklist, for example. So these names have been removed from the blacklist. Then also the president, there was a new legislation concerning demonstrations. Also regarding speech and assembly. So before, this gathering now would not be legal because we are more than 5 people. So after 2013, gatherings of more than 5 are allowed, and people are also allowed to demonstrate. The media censorship has been abolished, and labor unions have been legalized, and there's also some efforts to resolve land confiscation cases. But still, freed political prisoners face persecution. There is still a lot of violence in the country. Although the censorship has been abolished, there's still many other repressive laws that are used to prosecute activists and journalists. The peace process is also not going very well in the country, and actually fighting intensified in some regions, resulting in the increase of human rights violations. Let me just very quickly define what is democratization. So it is a progress towards a more rule-based and participatory type of politics. It is expected to create a more accountable and transparent government, and it should render violence unnecessary, because now all the groups are consulted on a regular basis and are able to express their views and interests, except for this is not true in Myanmar. So how this whole top-down transition came about? It started in about the year 2003 with the roadmap to, and notice the name, Discipline Flourishing Democracy. So this already tells us something. It's not a roadmap to democracy, it's a roadmap to discipline flourishing democracy. So that would be more like a Singapore style or something like that. So in 2008, we have a constitution that has been adopted, and based on this new constitution, the 2010 multi-party elections were organized, with the result of having a new nominally civilian government. All this was a controlled change, and the military designed a system that would embed a strong role for the defense forces in the following regime. So here's the roadmap with its 7 steps. I highlighted the most important one, so drafting the constitution, but that's of course not enough. You have to adopt it through a referendum. So there was a referendum in 2008 with a very suspiciously high voter turnout rate, and that was just a few days after the cyclone Nargis. So you can probably imagine what I'm hinting here. And then based on the constitution that has been adopted, there were elections in 2010 and then later elections in 2015. So the reason behind this transition was certainly to revive the economy, attract foreign capital, and also integrate into the global trading system. Some other reasons, and probably a strong reason for the change, was rising China and the relationship between Myanmar and China, international sanctions, and then a theoretical reason, which is the unsustainability of authoritarian rule in the long term. But again, we could organize another lecture about speaking about the transition and the reasons that drove the military to change. So while I was living in Myanmar, I spoke to people about the transition. And so here are a few of the quotes that people told me. So for example, the elections will bring back confidence of the people, not a regime change. This is the first time people can really participate. They have confidence they can make a change. So this was in an interview in 2015 before the elections of that year. Another quote, the military is very clever. They will grant some openness and change, but the masses will not really benefit from this. So some people were hopeful, some people were more skeptical about what was happening. So in the new system, the constitution grants significant power to the military, which means, so for example, there's 25% of seats in the parliament are reserved to the military, and plus the military controls 3 key ministries. So the elections in 2010, the result was 76% for the newly created party by military officials. The name is USDP. So here we can see a chart. And the names are not so important, just maybe rather look at, so the blue color, that's the newly created military party. So they won the majority of the seats, and plus you can see the 25% reserved for the military in both houses, the House of Representatives and the House of Nationalities. So then they elected a new president, Thein Sein, the one who came with those reforms I told you about. And in 2015, he invited foreign observers to come observe the elections. In 2010, foreign observers were not invited. Between the elections in 2010 and 2015, there were by-elections because there were 48 vacant seats. And so this was actually the first time that Aung San Suu Kyi officially participated, because in 2010 she boycotted the elections because she didn't agree with the constitution. And this time she ran for election, and her party took 43 seats. So this is how she became first a parliamentarian, and then she ran again in the elections in 2015. So I was there the whole time before the elections, during the election campaign, and I worked for an NGO, and we organized, not only our NGO, but all the NGOs organized civic education sessions and leaflets like this one here, teaching people how to vote, because most of the people did never have this experience. So again, I was speaking to people and asked them about their expectations, and people told me, if the elections are free and fair, the NLD will win. The NLD is Aung San Suu Kyi's party, at this point still an opposition party. Some other people told me, whether the NLD wins or loses, the military will stay. And even if the NLD won, there is still a century of repairs to be done. So again, you can see all kinds of ideas about it. So as I mentioned, international observers were allowed. There were about 1,000 observers, and they endorsed the elections as credible, but they also pointed out that it will not really herald a fundamental transfer of power. So the next elections are going to take place in 2020, most likely in November. The official date has not been announced, and I really hope I will manage to go as one of the international observers and observe the elections. So here you can see the 2015 results, very different from the 2010. This time the opposition party ran, the NLD, and won the majority of the seats, but still we have the 25% of the military that is still there. So under the new system, the NLD is in control of lawmaking and also in control of choosing the president. The military, however, still has the 25% in the parliament, and the three key ministries, defense, border affairs, and home affairs, which home affairs is all kinds of registration, and the police is under this ministry. So the Aung San Suu Kyi could not become president because of the constitution. There is a sub-clause that bars her from becoming a president because somebody thought of that early on when drafting the constitution. And so nobody who has a foreign spouse or children with a citizenship other than Burmese can become president. And so her close ally, Tin Chaw, became the president, and he left the presidency last year, and in his place came Win Min, again a close ally of Aung San Suu Kyi. You probably don't hear much about these presidents because they are basically puppets. Yeah. So when you hear about something in Myanmar, it's either Aung San Suu Kyi or the military. In many countries, for example in Taiwan, the president is also the commander-in-chief. This is not the case in Myanmar. So the commander-in-chief is the General Min Aung Hlaing, who is responsible for human rights violation that amount to genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Fun fact, in August 2018, he and some other generals were banned from Facebook because of all the hate speech. So before 2017-18, Facebook did not have any Burmese-speaking moderators. So it was not controlled what was happening on Facebook. Now it's a little different. They have Burmese-speaking moderators, but again, it's very questionable. If you imagine that's your job to check hate speech every day, must be a very tough job. Like, I mean, you can only do as much, right? And then you get very tired of that. Okay, so altogether you have 135 ethnicities in Myanmar, 7 large minorities, the Chin, Kachin, Mon, Karenni, Karen, Rakhine, and Shan, and the majority population, the Burmans. Bamar or Burman, these are two names, but it's basically the same. So please notice that the Rakhines are one of the 7 largest minorities, and the state where the Rohingya live is called the Rakhine State, and that's no coincidence. So this region was called Arakan, as you can see in this map, and then it was renamed to Rakhine State at some point, which strengthened the Rakhines. And in this map you can see the minority groups of Myanmar. So the center is very Bamar or Burman, and the borders are belong to minority groups. So the the Rakhine State, is inhabited by the Rakhines, by the Rohingya, but you can also find other smaller ethnic minorities like the Chins, the Dainets, the Mro, and the Kami. The 2 main religions of this state is Buddhism and Islam. And here we have again a map. The capital city of this state is Sitwe. So this region had a lot of population movements from both the east and west, and then later came under British rule, and as I mentioned, in 1989 it was renamed from Arakan to Rakhine State. During my time in Myanmar, I interviewed many people. So originally I went to the country to study the transition. But because I worked in an NGO and I had several Rohingya colleagues, and then I just kept hearing about what was happening, I just couldn't ignore it. And so I interviewed them, I even wrote a paper about it, and since then I kind of work on this issue, whether part of Amnesty International or also in my academic work. I want to introduce two of my interviewees. So this first one, she is a Muslim woman. She's half Rohingya, half Kaman. Kaman is also another type of Muslim people living in Myanmar. So she was my colleague. She was working in an NGO in Yangon, the biggest city, used to be the capital city, not anymore. Do you know what's the name of the capital city of Myanmar? Naypyidaw. Yeah. So the old one is Yangon, the new one is Naypyidaw. But still, mostly you hear things happening in Yangon. So she was working with children in orphanages, and she was able to build quite an okay life, even though she didn't have any documents. She didn't hold any citizenship. So she moved to Yangon in 2013 because of all the violence that was happening since the year 2012. And the whole family had to leave everything behind, and they moved with a 45-day permit to travel abroad. Of course, they're not supposed to stay, they can only travel around for 45 days, and then they're supposed to come back, which they never did. And they settled down, the whole family, in Yangon. So it was a family of 2 parents and 3 children, and to make this move, they split into 2 groups. The mom took 1 child, the father took 2 kids, and they traveled on different dates by plane, and then they reunited in Yangon. They did this so they wouldn't be suspected of leaving the Rakhine State. She told me that her life was relatively peaceful before the year 2012, and she was actually not really complaining about her new life. And then she also told me that in Yangon she was fine, but then in some parts of the city she had to take off her hijab for safety reasons. The second interviewee I want to interview is also from the Rakhine State, but this is a Buddhist man. He comes from a small village in this state, and he told me that before the year 2012 he has not even heard the word Rohingya. But also I have to point out that he didn't live in those areas where the Rohingya people live. He lived more in the south. And he moved to Yangon for economic reasons, because if he had stayed in his village, he could only become a fisherman or a farmer, and he didn't want any of these 2 careers. So he came to Yangon, he studied, and then when I asked him whether he identifies as a Myanmar citizen or a Rakhine person, he told me that he feels like a citizen of this world. And he compared Myanmar to a broken family. The authorities usually refer to the Rohingya as Bengali. They never use the word Rohingya, and sometimes they even call them Kala, which is not a nice name to call foreigners, usually of Indian descent. The Buddhist man interviewee, he also believed that he called them Bengalis, and he believed they came from Bangladesh. But then he also added, it's not their fault they're here, the British invited them. Then I also asked the first interviewee, and she told me she did not feel comfortable being called Bengali, and nobody called her that before the year 2012. And then again, she also emphasized she is a Myanmar citizen. So these days you can find lots of academic papers about the origin of the Rohingya people. Like, did the British invite them? Where did they come from? Have they lived in Rakhine State for as long as they claim or not? Well, the thing is that both the Rakhines and the Rohingya insist they are natives to the said region, and I actually think it doesn't matter, because that happened a very, very long time ago. And here you have quotes of, one is from Francis Buchanan, from long time ago, from 1799, he wrote a book where he actually mentions the Rohingya. So many researchers consider this the oldest source where somebody outside of today's Myanmar refers to the people as Rohingya. Then, on the other hand, we have a quote of the senior general that I mentioned in my previous slides, and he said, Bengalis do not have any characteristics or culture in common with ethnicities of Myanmar. Then also it's very tricky if you ask me how many people are there, how many Rohingya people are there. It's very unclear. I've heard numbers ranging from 1 to 3 million. And we don't really have this number because the last census in Myanmar was in 2014. And in the coding list, there was not the option of Rohingya, so the Rohingya people required to identify as other or as foreigner. And the results have never been released, so that's another thing. Even if we knew how many people identified as foreigners, we don't really have this number because this is very sensitive information and has never been released. The previous census was in 1983, but again, the Rohingya people were excluded from the statistics back then. In Myanmar, you have various groups of Muslim people. We could divide it in 3 big groups. One are the Muslims in the west of the country, so the Rohingya. Then we have the Chinese descent Muslims, mostly in northern parts of Myanmar, and then the Indian descent Muslims, mostly living in Yangon. They are not facing such troubles as the stateless Rohingya. Also, it's not uncommon in a Muslim family for parents and their oldest child to have legal papers, and then the younger children not having any legal documents. Language is a very important part when it comes to identity, and so the Rohingya have their own language, which is a dialect of Chittagonian, and Chittagonian is a language that is spoken in southern Bangladesh. So it is related to Bengali, but the Rohingya language and Bengali are not mutually intelligible. Plus, the Rohingya seem to have different dialects in each township or village. So here you can see an overview. Since we're in Taiwan, I also included Chinese. So Chinese and Burmese belong to the Sino-Tibetan language, one of them being a Sinitic, one of them being a non-Sinitic language. They're of course not intelligible and they use different characters. And then Bengali and Chittagonian, the 2 languages spoken in Bangladesh, they both belong to Indo-Aryan languages, but again, they're not mutually intelligible. And then the Rohingya language is a subgroup or belongs or dialect of Chittagonian. Okay, so I mentioned that this conflict is not a new one, although I mentioned the years 2012, 16 and 17. Segregation has been going on for a very long time, and the Rohingya were, or those few that still remain in the country are, barred from traveling within or between townships without a permit. So this means if a person is sick, they first have to obtain a travel permit and then they're able to travel and access healthcare. Very often they can only travel between Muslim villages. Also, they're not allowed to live together or have children unless they're married. And if they want to get married, again, they have to obtain a permission, which involves bribes usually. In certain parts of Rakhine State, there was a 2-child policy to limit the number of children of the Muslim population. And since 1994, the government stopped issuing Rohingya children birth certificates, which if you don't have a birth certificate, you're not permitted to attend state-run secondary schools. If you don't attend secondary schools, you can become a teacher. If you don't have teachers, then you have to invite teachers from other parts to come teach in those schools, and it's basically a vicious circle which results in a very, very high illiteracy rate, as high as 80% in a country where many people can read and write, and people love to read newspapers, and they had to lobby to become one of the least developed nations because their literacy rate was so high. Then in 2015, we have the 4 race and religion laws, which are in all of Myanmar, not only in the Rakhine State. And that's the population control law applied to Muslim women, the Buddhist women's special marriage law. That means if Buddhist women want to marry Muslims, they're not really allowed. They have to apply for a permit, or they have to try to convert. But that is, again, very difficult. Again, you need a permission to convert. And the 4th one is the monogamy law. This was all passed in 2015. So the Muslims, so not only the Rohingya, but the Muslim population is politically marginalized. There are no Muslim civil society organizations in Rakhine. Although people have applied and tried to create such groups, they have always been rejected. Very interesting, in 2010, the Rohingya were handed white cards to vote. So imagine these people have no citizenship, they don't have any legal documents, but suddenly they're handed these white cards to vote. And that was because the newly created USDP knew that the Rohingya will vote for them. So this was a way how to make sure they get more votes. This was a sure 500,000 or more votes for the party. So this is why they handed them out white cards. And we thought for a long time when we were in Myanmar that they would keep the white cards and be able to vote in the 2015 elections, but that was not the case. A few months before the elections, these cards were revoked. Some of the people hid the cards in the ground behind their house because this was their only documentation they had, so they didn't want to give it up. Also, since 2014, people with white cards, back then they still had those white cards, they were banned from forming or joining political parties. And here you can see a picture, so this is what a white card looked like. Yes?
The other groups use different kind of cards.
Yes, because the citizenship law divides the people in 3 different groups and of citizens. I'll speak about that in a bit. But these white cards were exclusively for voting, for the Rohingya people to be able to go and vote based on this card. So when speaking about the Rakhine State, and we mentioned the Rohingya people a lot, I want to emphasize that human rights abuses, very serious human rights abuses, are also against the Buddhist Rakhine population. Especially lately, you can see in the news a lot about the Tamado, which is the Burmese name for the military, against the Arakan army. And the Arakan army are the Buddhist Rakhines who fight for autonomy, or even probably not independence, more autonomy. So very often people are tortured, killed, their land is confiscated, or they're forced to work for these armies and so on. So let me go back to those 3 crucial years. In 2012, although there was a long history of communal violence, and also this is what I was told by my interviewees, that sometimes there were periods when they lived peacefully side by side, there were periods when there was communal tension between the groups. So in 2012, a large-scale violence broke out after the alleged rape and murder of a young Buddhist woman by 3 Muslim men. I looked into this, and it's quite interesting. So the woman was brutally murdered and robbed. She has not been raped, and none of the perpetrators was Rohingya. They were Muslim men, but none of them was Rohingya. This is not to excuse this brutal murder of the woman, just showing that some facts were kind of like screwed a little bit. So reports about the incident were running on TV for one full day non-stop. This is what my interviewee told me. No crime has ever been reported for such an extended period of time. And then people, of course, got very angry, and so there were lots of incidents where people killed each other. For example, in Tongop, 10 Muslims were forced off a bus at a government checkpoint. There's lots of checkpoints all over Myanmar, and especially in the Rakhine State, and they were beaten by the Buddhists to death. And we had lots of other incidents like that. My Rohingya interviewee told me, I've seen from our window how Rakhine people marched to a Muslim fisherman village nearby my house and burned it down. They didn't attack our house because it was in the middle of a Rakhine neighborhood. So she lived in Sittwe, the capital city, and most likely she was from a family that was better off. The violence spread from Rakhine State also to other parts of the country, and the government responded by separating communities and placing them into displacement camps, which in the short term, this is not a bad move, but it's definitely counterproductive in the long term. And then in 2014, we saw leaked documents where we learned about the plan to relocate the Rohingya to permanent camps instead of allowing them to go back to their homes. Violence spread also to other regions, to Mandalay, which is in central Myanmar, and to other places too. And the result was thousands of Rohingya people living in internal displacement camps in really bad conditions, or taking to the sea and trying to find refuge in other countries. Back in 2015, George Soros compared himself, he's an American-Hungarian Jew, and he compared himself to the Rohingya. In 1944, as a Jew in Budapest, I too was a Rohingya. Much like the Jewish ghettos set up by the Nazis in Eastern Europe during World War II, Aung Mingalar has become the involuntary home of thousands of families. Aung Mingalar is one of the internal displacement camps. So where did they go? Those that did not end up in the displacement camps, they tried to go to Malaysia, Thailand, Bangladesh and Singapore, but very often these ships were pushed back on sea and they were not allowed on land. Also another problem is that even if the people made it to these countries, the countries that surround Myanmar are not among the signatories of the Refugee Convention or the later protocol. These are two key documents that define who a refugee is, what a refugee's rights are, and also what are the legal obligations of the states. So these countries surrounding Myanmar have no legal framework, although in Malaysia, for example, there are refugee camps run by the UNHCR, and they hand people UNHCR identity cards. However, if, for example, a Malaysian policeman finds somebody with such an identification, they do not have to respect this kind of identification, and they could deport the people back to Myanmar, as they basically regard them as undocumented migrants. So what are the options of refugees or people on the move when they get to a certain country? It's either integration, which is very difficult if you can't apply for asylum. It's repatriation, which should always be voluntary, or resettlement to third countries. So the US, Canada, Ireland, they have been resettling Rohingya, but of course the numbers are very low. When I asked my interviewee, the Rohingya woman, whether she would want to leave Myanmar, she told me, I don't want to leave Myanmar, where would I go? It is enough that I had to leave my hometown in Rakhine State and start afresh in Yangon. Then we come to the year 2016, and here comes ARSA into play, a militant group, Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army. So this group with Rohingya villagers attacked 3 police posts and killed 9 police officers. The response of the Tamado, which is the Burmese name of the military, was a clearance operation in which they razed dozens of villages, they opened fire on civilians, they killed people, they gang raped women, they burned victims alive, arrested hundreds of people, and the result of all this is 94,000 displaced people inside the country, and then more than 70,000 people fleeing to Bangladesh. So back then, the government published an investigation report in which it actually accused the Rohingya of burning down their own houses. A year later, on August 25th, 2017, ARSA attacked again police outposts and killed 12 officials. This was mostly in the northern parts of Rakhine State. And the response was clearance operations by the military, again not distinguishing between militants and civilians at all. This event was marked by widespread systematic human rights violations, unlawful killings, rape, torture, disappearances, detentions, and it resulted over the next few months in more than 700,000 people fleeing to neighboring Bangladesh. So very often soldiers would enter a village from 2 sides and open fire on people as they were fleeing from the village. After that, they burned down the village. And also, Amnesty International researchers found that the majority of the burning of these villages occurred during the rainy season. So this means that it required some planning and determination to do so. Here we can see a map of where people were fleeing from the Rakhine State. So after they crossed the border with Bangladesh, they settled down in refugee sites, and here we can see how they grew. The bigger one, Kutupalong, with more than 600,000 people. Here we have a map of how these settlements grew. So the yellow part is the original refugee camp, which then became bigger, the light orange color, and then the dark red. All right, so you might be wondering, who is ARSA? Who is behind ARSA? So ARSA was formed in 2013, and it seems, because we don't know too much about it, it is financed by the Rohingya people living in the Gulf, mostly in Saudi Arabia and in the United Arab Emirates. The leaders are of Rohingya origin from Bangladesh or Pakistan, and it seems like many of them have received training from jihadists in Afghanistan. They started recruiting inside of Myanmar, in Rakhine State, in 2013, and it seems that by the attacks in 2017, they had quite a big group of people. They were able to mobilize lots of villagers, whether voluntary or not, that remains a big question. And that day, on August 25th, it's very likely that there were several thousand people armed with sticks and homemade bombs and explosives. Before the attacks, there were several videos by the ARSA leaders where they explicitly denied any links with transnational jihadi movements, and they also said they would not target civilians. Well, as I said, we don't know too much about ARSA, but one is certain. The Rohingya people, as well as the other communities, they live in fear that ARSA may attack them next or come and forcibly recruit Rohingya people to join ARSA and then kill the other communities, as has been the case. Should we take a little break? What do you think?
It's up to you.
You need a break?
Normally after you finish, then you have a break. Then
Okay, so let's just continue. Good. So in the last few weeks, you probably heard a lot of talk about Myanmar genocide, and Some people are wondering, is it ethnic cleansing, is it genocide? So let me tell you that there's no doubt that genocide has taken place in Myanmar, although an official definition falls within the competence of a future international tribunal. Do you know the difference between ethnic cleansing and genocide? So under international law, genocide differs from ethnic cleansing in that crimes are committed with a specific intent to completely or partially destroy a group of people. In Myanmar, we see that 4 out of 5 genocidal acts have been committed. And those are the 4 listed there: killing, causing serious bodily or mental harm, inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction, and imposing measures intended to prevent births. Genocide is not just a one-time mass killing incident, but it's a long-lasting process of systematic and deliberate destruction of a target group. And Tamado's, the military's disproportionate response in Rakhine State was without any doubt premeditated, because before August 25th, in the months before that, the Burmese army was bringing into Rakhine State a lot of military personnel and equipment. And again, based on research by Amnesty International, the researchers were able to obtain recordings of phone calls between military officers and residents in which they warned that they got an order to burn down the entire village and destroy everything if they did not leave peacefully. If you ever have time, I recommend you to watch this movie. It's a documentary by Frontline called Myanmar's Killing Fields. It's a 50-something minute documentary. It's not easy to watch, but it gives you a very good idea of what is happening in Rakhine, or what was happening in Rakhine. So we have a lot of evidence. We have interviews, we have photos, we have satellite images, videos, leaked documents, and they all identify the Tamado and other officials to be the perpetrators. 6 months after August, so 6 months after the start of the brutal military campaign, Burmese authorities started remaking northern Rakhine State. They cleared burned villages and built new homes, and it seems that they built security force bases and infrastructure in the place of those villages. Let me show you a picture. So this is a satellite image of a certain village in Rakhine State. It's from October 2017, and you can quite clearly see burned structures. And now I will show you another picture a few months later, February. So that's like 3-4 months later, and it's very different. So here we can see new structures and also a fence. So this kind of tells us these are probably some military barracks or something like that. So when speaking about the military, in the first phase the military seemed guilty not of causing the violence, but only of not doing enough to stop it. Then later the military took active part in the violence. And then thirdly, it seems that the military wanted to make northern Rakhine State unlivable for the Rohingya population. The media, the state-run media, refers to the Rohingya as, and I quote, a thorn that has to be removed as it pierces, or, I quote again, detestable human fleas. We should not underestimate this enemy. So also the state-run media never used the word Rohingya, and they refrain from criticizing the military actions and also the Buddhist and nationalist groups. I will tell you more about it in the following slides. There were some journalists that tried to look into these Rohingya massacres, and many of them were detained. This is a case of 2, Wallone and Jozou. They were set up by the police, they were handed some documents, and right after that detained on the grounds of possessing classified state documents. And they spent altogether 500 days in prison, and they were actually sentenced first to 14 years, then to 7 years, and they were released after a presidential pardon a few months ago. So they were sentenced based on the Official Secrets Act. And the Official Secrets Act is one of the restrictive laws that still remain in place. The Official Secrets Act is a very, very old law from colonial times, from 1923. So although censorship has been abolished, this means that propaganda slogans have been removed, private newspapers have been allowed, there still are these restrictive laws, and journalists have to be very, very careful in Myanmar. Let me talk a little bit about the root causes, like you mentioned the citizenship law, but also other causes. So, there is a broader anxiety in Burmese society about ethnic groups or about indigeneity. So the ability to claim membership may be the only way to secure access to those very few resources and opportunities in the country. You may ask yourselves, why does the rest of the country reject the Rohingya? So we know that the Buddhists and the Muslims in Rakhine State, there was some communal violence from time to time. But how about the other people of Myanmar? And again, there's the eager participation of Rakhine nationalist elites in the exclusion of Rohingya. They elevate their standing in the system, and then this applies also to other groups, to other nationalists of other ethnic orientations. Then also, if we look back in the history, it seems that the British favored the Bengalis in agricultural schemes, and in the 1880s facilitated resettlement and cyclical migration of laborers from Chittagong. Also, under the Japanese occupation in the 40s, there was intercommunal violence, which led to a project of mutual ethnic cleansing, sending the Rakhine Buddhists south and the Rohingya north. And then everything from coins to flags to wrestling, which is very typical from that region, has been rendered exclusively Rakhine State. Also, the state has been renamed to Rakhine State. So when the Union of Burma was founded at the Panglong Conference in 1947, there was Aung San, which is the father of Aung San Suu Kyi. He was actually the one who established the Burmese military, and he participated, or maybe he was even the leader of the Panglong Conference, which was preparing for a new country based on mutual recognition, political equality, and self-determination and voluntary association of all the groups who wanted to belong to the Union of Burma. But he was assassinated a little before independence, and then the constitution was rushed through, and as a result the country was submerged into 5 decades of civil wars. Also during the Second World War, the Rohingya were loyal to the British, the Rakhine to the Japanese, so this again caused problems between the two groups. Then just before independence, there was a rebellion in today's Rakhine State in the north, and there was a group that attempted to incorporate northern Arakan, because that's what the region was called back then, into East Pakistan. And after independence, as a response to this, UNU, the prime minister, made Buddhism the state religion, which empowered the Rakhines, and also he placed Arakan under direct military control to drive out those remaining rebels that tried to become part of East Pakistan. And then with the dictator Nevin in 1974, he created a new constitution where he recognized the Rakhines as one of the 135 national ethnic groups and the Rohingya not. Also, the violence that we have seen, or the ethnic cleansing, it's not new. You had two operations, one in the 70s, one in the 90s, that drove a lot of people to neighboring Bangladesh, but most of the people were repatriated. And then we come to the National Citizenship Law from 1982, which divides the people into three kinds of citizens: full, associate, and naturalized citizens. They have all different colors of IDs. And based on this, the Rohingya became stateless, because with this new law, people had to come forward and prove that they came to Myanmar, their ancestors came before 1823. The problem with the Rohingya was that they either lacked formal documents to prove so, because they either never had papers, or their papers were destroyed or taken in various civil disturbances, or they simply did not know and they missed the deadline because of unawareness. So yeah, many years later, 30, 40 years later, they're still not considered nationals. Yep, so because the Muslims, because the Rohingya couldn't vote in 2015, the consequence of this is that there are no Rohingya representatives in the legislature, and no more reason for any party to take into account their views. And so we have to understand that ARSA resorting to violence, it stems from the alienation of the people from effective participation in the newly so-called democratic system. We call this electoral violence, and because they had little to lose if they resort to violence, which then in turn gives new oxygen to the nationalist groups, where they portray Islam as a threat to the country. Much of the blame lies with two movements. One is the 969 movement, the other one is Mabata, and maybe you have heard of Viratu, a monk from Mandalay, which the Time magazine has called the face of Buddhist terror. So it was actually Mabata that insisted that the government revoke the white cards before the elections in 2015, and under pressure the government did so. So this kind of demonstrates how hate speech and Buddhist nationalism in Myanmar set political agendas. Also, it's this group that rallied for the adoption of those 4 discriminatory laws, the race and religion laws that were passed in 2015. And this group also rallied against Aung San Suu Kyi, based on which she then decided not to field any Muslim candidate in the elections. So here we can see how religion and politics seriously got mixed up, even though the law forbids this. It's very interesting to compare the rhetorics of the influential monks and army officers in Myanmar to the Central European politicians when it comes to refugees. So according to the latest Eurobarometer, people from the country I come from believe that the biggest threat to the European Union is immigration and terrorism. And this is in a country where we grant about 5 asylums per year, and the closest action to a terrorist attack was like a homemade bomb in the McDonald's trash can a few years ago. So, like most people in Central Europe have never seen a refugee, most people in Myanmar have never seen a Rohingya, because the Rohingya live in the northern part of Rakhine State. Okay, so let me speak a little bit about the reaction to all this. A reaction from different stakeholders. So let me start with the reaction of the government. So the Aung San Suu Kyi administration has not prioritized human rights, and she did not use her political and moral authority to promote and protect human rights. She actually described the allegations of rape as rumors, fabricated stories, and one-sided accusations. This was back in 2016. With this, she's enabling the continued vilification and dehumanization of the Rohingya, same as the media. Although Mabata, one of those two groups that I mentioned, has been banned in 2017, Viratu has also been banned from public speaking for 1 year, but he has violated this without any real consequences. The military came forward with a message saying, "Trust us." This was just a few months ago when the military created an investigation court to probe violence in 2017. But this court consists of 3 senior military officials, so you can imagine what the outcome will be. So far, 7 soldiers have been sentenced to 10 years in prison, but they were released after a few years, so no real punishment. Let me tell you about the international reactions. So let's start with the United Nations Human Rights Council. It has sent an independent international fact-finding mission to Myanmar. The government did not really cooperate. At first they refused to grant visas and they could not access all those regions they wanted to. But in their final report, they came to the conclusion that Myanmar breached its obligation not to commit genocide and continues to harbor genocidal intent. And it had 3 recommendations. The first one was for the Security Council to refer the situation in Myanmar to the ICC, which is very unlikely to happen because we have Russia and China in the Security Council. The second was to impose targeted sanctions, and the third one is establishing, and this already happened, in 2018, an international mechanism for Myanmar to collect and preserve evidence has been created. And this evidence will be used for future prosecutions, just like the ones that started a few months ago. The United Nations Security Council failed to adopt any strong resolution on the Rohingya. We only saw China having informal meetings with Myanmar and Bangladesh with the result of a very controversial repatriation agreement. And yes, this agreement would violate the principle of non-refoulement. The ICC, now here this is a little tricky. So the ICC was created by the Rome Statute, and not all the countries are part of this. So Myanmar is not is not a signatory of the Rome Statute, Bangladesh is. So this court usually tries individuals, not states, and it tries 4 categories of crimes: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crime of aggression. In 2018, the pre-trial chamber gave green light, affirming, because there was a question of jurisdiction, since genocide happened in Myanmar, and Myanmar is not a party to the Rome Statute. But then, forced deportation, which is a crime against humanity, involves crossing borders, so crossing from Myanmar to Bangladesh, and Bangladesh already is a party to the Rome Statute. So the pre-trial chamber gave green light, and actually this year in July the office of the prosecutor filed requests for authorization of an investigation into these crimes against the Rohingya. So they will not focus on genocide because they don't have jurisdiction for that, but they will try the forced deportation. This will obviously take many years. And the same, the ICJ, this is also a process that will take many years. It started in November 2019 when the Gambia, a small African country, filed suit against Myanmar in the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, also sometimes called the World Court. It's the United Nations principal judicial organ, in which only states can bring cases against other states. So here the focus is on Myanmar's responsibility as a state. So the ICC will try some generals and the people in the military. The ICJ will try the country, the state. The ICJ does not engage in its own independent investigation, such as the ICC, for example, does. And here, Gambia is actually in charge of bringing all the evidence. The UN mechanism for preserving evidence will be used in this case. And then maybe also some of the ICC investigation may be used at the ICJ. And just for you to understand what the ICJ does, so an example from the past is Bosnia versus Serbia, in which this court determined that Serbia violated its duties to prevent and punish genocide under the convention. This case took 15 years from the starting point when Bosnia filed the case in 1993 to the final judgment. But the ICJ entered provisional measures just 19 days after the application, and these provisional measures are binding. And this is what the Gambia is hoping to happen now, that the court would enter some provisional measures to Myanmar. A third thing that has been happening, so the first one ICC, ICJ, and the third one, less publicized, is Argentina. And so domestic courts in third-party states under the theories universal jurisdiction can sue Myanmar, but depends on the constitution of the country. But the constitution of Argentina has this universal jurisdiction, and so a Burmese Rohingya organization and some other groups, they filed a lawsuit in Argentina under this principle. And they will prosecute individuals for serious crimes against international law, such as crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, and torture. So in this case here, they will try also Aung San Suu Kyi because she's the de facto leader of Myanmar. Okay. This is the fun part of this presentation. So obviously we have all kinds of reactions by the government, by the military, by the international community, but also you have some activists inside of the country. And let me show you a 2-minute video about musicians that call themselves the Rebel Riots, and they stand up against oppression by music. I'm not sure if this is going to work, but let's see. Yeah, I'm thinking I could do that, copy paste. And okay, it's coming, yeah. It's a very tricky mouse. Oops. See?
This song is called Stop Resistance, a cat resistance across this house.
My name is Jojo. I am 21 years old. I come from Yangon. I play guitar and vocalist and rebel riot. We formed Rebel Riot in 2007 because 2007 is we had the Saffron Revolution. One day, the military army come and shoot lots of people on the street. They killing lots of people. I feel so scary. because I never saw people killing each other from me. After Saffron Revolution, we decide ourselves, what can we do to fight back? We have no power, we have no weapon. What about the music? Music can speak out to fight back. We can screaming for justice, for equality, for the human rights. That sounds like monk should do, monk job. Mostly who hate the Islam people, they are mostly Islam Mabada monks. For me, the first 6 months, this is not religion, this is a politics, carve up on religion. And revolution is love. Without love is a violence. So revolution cannot exist without love.
Okay, so although I really dislike that kind of music, I thought it's quite interesting to see that you have some people inside of Myanmar that stand up for these people. So let me proceed to the conclusion. So we know that democracies don't fight each other and have less frequent domestic armed conflicts. However, when there's a regime change, it can have destabilizing consequences, very often called the dark side of democracy. With this said, I want to emphasize that it's not diversity that destabilizes and leads to violence, but the politicization of that diversity. And so democratization or regime change provides opportunities for such kind of mobilization. And that's when elites from the old regime are seeking strategies that will prevent their fall, such as the military generals, while rising elites are trying to muscle in. Certain political actors may play the ethnic card and incite hostility towards other ethnic groups, and this is exactly what's happening in Myanmar. Also, exclusion from politics increases the chance of conflict. And if we look at the conflicts in Rakhine State, it's kind of a triangle. On one, we have there the Buddhist Rakhines, the Rohingya Muslims, and the Myanmar government. And at certain point of time, the government or the military, they joined forces with the Buddhist Rakhines against the Rohingya Muslims. But, as I mentioned, the Arakan army, now the military is fighting the Buddhist Rakhines. So people very often ask me for what do I think what is going to happen. So I'm just going to quote Mark Twain, making predictions is very difficult, especially about the future. And before I finish, these are the latest developments about the Arakan army. So it recruits mostly ethnic Rakhine people who are mostly Buddhist, and they're fighting for greater autonomy in Rakhine State. So the Arakan army has carried out ambushes, assassinations, bomb attacks in recent weeks, and on the other side, the military is accused of heavy-handed response to this, including attacks on civilian areas. And the Buddhist people living there. What the international community can do, I was thinking about this and I came up with 3 measures. So one would be expand assistance to Burmese NGOs that promote ethno-religious tolerance, sponsor education and cultural exchange programs that enlighten, and then also apply pressure on the Tamado's business empire, because the Burmese military has a lot of businesses. All right, and with this we come to questions. And after questions, if we have some time, I have actually prepared some additional materials, but there are more for you, for those who have not been to Myanmar, a few pictures, so you can better imagine what it is like in that country. But yeah, your questions first.
Okay, thank you. Let's have a 10-minute break.
Good, good, good.
Come back to the previous.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. You can have my presentation. I can.
Between the Rakhine people. So with the federal or the union, with the federal government or the central government, and because this seems to me that from the presentation it says also there's multiple conflicts or dynamics also both within the states and the whole union.
So when I lived in Yangon, I remember, so the taxi drivers in Yangon, they come from all parts of the country. And I remember speaking to this Rakhine gentleman, the driver, and it was very interesting because he was emphasizing to me that, I mean, he is Rakhine, so that was very important to him, like this identity. He also, back then I could still speak Burmese, now my Burmese is very, very poor. He was even joking with me that my Burmese is better than his because his mother tongue is Rakhine. So it seems that there is a sharp distinction between the Burmans, the majority population, and the Rakhines. The Rakhines have historically been viewed as lazy people by the central government or the majority population. But of course, when it came to the Rohingya, that was when they teamed up against the Rohingya. But traditionally, they don't like each other because the Rakhines actually, they were in the Panglong Agreement in 1947, they were promised autonomy, or they were promised to be able to apply for greater autonomy after 10 years in the Union of Burma. That was the idea. But then, after the assassination of Aung San, things went a very different direction.
In your conclusion, you associate the democratization with the process of democratization probably would worsen the conflicts, ethnic conflicts. I think it's quite understandable. In many places, even in Taiwan, the so-called ethnic politics, is suffering for maybe 2 or 3 decades, or accompany along the process of democratization. And somewhere, Li Guangyao excused the not fully democracy in Singapore with this reason. He said that he know that if some kind of implementation of a more fuller democracy, then the ethnic conflict or ethnic politics will be worsened. I don't know. I don't know whether this is a really valid excuse.
I think it's also similar to the situation of Burma is in the during that legacy of the World War II, when the Japanese went to the Southeast Asia,
sure.
that kind of because before that
everywhere, also Taiwan, we have a legacy of a colonial legacy. Everywhere, the conflicts in Africa or other places, South Asia, has a legacy of that, just like Singapore.
But I don't think we can blame it on things that happened such a long time ago. We can, because this is what tends to happen with the Myanmar and all these problems. People tend to blame the colonial times, the British. Like, yes, certainly they introduced some systems and so on, but that was a long time ago, and since then the country gained independence. And if it does not include all its people, then these are the outcomes of it. So the Rohingya have been sidelined, not able to participate at all.
But similar things also happen in Indonesia and also in Malaysia to a large extent. And also in Vienna, some marginalized people, like the Highland people and the Khmer Krom. Apparently it is not only the colonial legacy, that is put this to the hierarchical orders among these groups. But that also involves local, for example, in Vienna, the vet or king people, they are the power they want you to dominate. Or in Indonesia, this so-called indigenous people, but or Malay, in Indonesia, but they actually further excluded their own indigenous people, the minority group on marginal islands. So it's power maneuvering. The new order, new economic system in Malaysia and Indonesia just stabilizes power hierarchy, like Myanmar too.
With this, you remind me of one thing that I forgot to say about the ICJ. So Aung San Suu Kyi actually going to those hearings on behalf of the Myanmar government, because all the stakeholders were invited. The military did not go. So like inside the country, the military did not go, the government did, Aung San Suu Kyi, so this gives her a lot of points inside the country. And it's election year next year, so she's really winning hearts by going to the ICJ.
We actually don't really understand San Suu Kyi. Could you say
I also don't
more
understand
about
her.
that?
I don't understand her. I wrote an article about her for the Slovak media on Monday. It's supposed to be published today or tomorrow. And I wrote an article about Aung San Suu Kyi. I wrote all that I know, how she was in house arrest for 15 years, from 1989 until 2011. In those years, for 15 years, she was in house arrest. Here I have to say, she wouldn't have survived if she was not the daughter, if she was not a prominent person, the daughter of General Aung San. Yeah? So this certainly saved her life. And so it seems that once she achieved what she was fighting for, like she was, for a long time she was seen as the icon of democracy, with that of human rights. Once she achieved what she wanted, she became a democratically elected leader, because she is really democratically elected. The 2015 elections, now forget about the flawed constitution, but I mean the elections were free and fair. So yeah, it seems now she's showing a different face.
Yeah, we our guess very from a very remote position is that she was maneuvered by this military people. But
It's very questionable how much power she actually has.
Yeah, that's
But it's certainly not very little power. She definitely has some power. The thing is now, with the whole Islamophobia in Myanmar, she belongs to the majority population. She's a Bamar. Most of the people in Myanmar are Bamar. Of course she wants to be re-elected. Like, she's quite old, she has now the chance to have power. So I believe these are her motivations.
I follow news about her since I think at first she made a visit to Europe and then United States before the election, right? I think many concerned people, journalists or other people, asked her about the situation of Rohingya. In Europe, she dodged the questions. So that at that time already some question marks on their suspicion. And then subsequent years, and we see some footage that you'll probably show her denying
Yeah.
any violation of it. But there are some, denying as some kind of rumors. Right?
Yeah.
And on one footage, she is, talking about this, denying that as rumors with laughter of people, of her own people. That is really disgusting.
It
You
is.
know,
It's,
and made me
too
rage,
much.
So it's very disappointing. That
Back then there were speculations that maybe she doesn't know what's happening. But now this can't be the case any longer. So you know that she got the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yes.
So there was a lot of talk about revoking
Killing
it, but that
us.
has never happened, so that doesn't seem to be possible. And actually it was Václav Havel, that the former Czechoslovak president, that nominated her, because he was nominated for the Peace Prize, but then he thought somebody else should receive it, so that like all the media attention goes towards some kind of a fight that has not yet been won, so that was her fight. And so he had some advisors who traveled to Japan, and in Japan those advisors met some Burmese groups, and so this is how they found out about Aung San Suu Kyi, and that's when he nominated her, and then they became pen pals. So she was in house arrest, and they would exchange letters, and then she wrote, while in house arrest, she wrote 2 or maybe more, but I read 2 books, and she dedicated these books to him. He also mentioned her in some books, but they never met in person, so that's kind of interesting. And then also she held some kind of a memorial, I think last year, for Václav Havel. So yeah, so I think he would be very upset if he knew. Then Amnesty International awarded her the Ambassador of Conscience Award in, I believe that was in 2006. And so Amnesty International revoked this. These are last year, so this prize was taken. And then she studied in Oxford. I don't remember the name of the college, but in that college there was a painting of her near the entrance hall. And in 2017, right after people found out in the news what was happening in Rakhine State, students of that university campaigned for the removal of that painting, and it has been removed and replaced by some other painting.
And the situation in Myanmar, we're not like India developed into finally some hostility toward religious minority, which is Muslim. You said that there is some other part of Muslim which are not facing the problems.
The Muslims living in Yangon seem very much integrated. For a short period of time, at some point after 2012, those groups, Mabata and 969, they called for boycotting all the Muslim people. So I mean, if you were building a house and you were a Buddhist, they would tell you, okay, go buy the building material not from someone who is a Muslim, but from someone who is a Buddhist. So their businesses might have suffered at that point for a while, but I don't think that's the case any longer. And if you go downtown Yangon, you will see lots of Indian descent Muslims in the streets, like everywhere. They live there, they're fully integrated, they're Burmese.
I would like to know more about the different category of the citizenship. Can you explain more about this? Because I think when I read the way of what your ancestors were already in Burma in 1823, that kind of I can't make sense to this.
It was designed to exclude the Rohingya, because in that part of Myanmar, we know that after 1823, that's when the British started inviting those migrant workers who came for, I don't know, half a year, went back for half a year. They were agricultural workers. So, I mean, the year 1823 is not a coincidence. It was kind of designed for them not to become citizens.
No,
And then these three different kinds of citizenship. Some have the right to vote. They have different rights.
so that's why in recent years I became so much interested in this politics of citizenship, especially in Southeast Asia. It's totally arbitrary. So when I mentioned this to our French colleague, he couldn't understand. He said, citizenship is all one nation knows, and there are no problem. But I said, it's here, especially in this multinational society. The citizenship is not transparent. They can be maneuvered. For example, for those people who have stayed here for hundreds of years, but still they could be excluded from the equal access. So some of them they have to choose their nationalities. For example, for the Malaysian people, they might be there for 300 or 400 years, but they have, or Indonesia, but they have to choose it. They are ethnic Chinese, even though they might have Arabic and Japanese and local mixed
They have to
origins.
choose, and
They
then
have to
based on
choose.
that in Malaysia,
Yeah,
they
right.
have different kind of
Yeah, right.
benefits.
And then when they have chosen, they could only choose ethnic Chinese. Then and also they are not Muslim. Then they are not open to a lot of rights and benefits. The Malaysian too. Yeah.
Yeah, in recent years there was a trend of supporting Malaysian businesses with certain tax benefits or
Right,
something
right.
like that, if
Yeah.
you were Malaysian.
No, I think, yeah, mostly it's in 1980s, 70s, after the, for example, in Indonesia, it's in the 70s, after the return through of the previous president, we started to this Malay primacy or Indonesian primacy system. So they have a quota reserved for their indigenous people, for investment, for or for education too.
You said that the questions of how long those Rohingyas came here and stayed there is another important issue. So you skip that. For me, I read something that showing indicating that they have been there for about the 6th century. Something.
Yeah, right.
Yep, yeah.
It's not only during this British colonial
Yeah,
period,
yeah.
it's much longer.
Yeah. I didn't
far
want
back.
to say it's not important, you know. I just wanted to say that the focus on that makes me personally angry. Because even if the Rohingya, for example, a person now that is my age, and this person knows that his or her grandparents already lived there, so what's the point in looking any further than that? But this is from a very kind of like a personal perspective. And you can find lots of papers that will prove that they have been there for many centuries. There are lots of papers that say the opposite. I even found some researches that suggest that they are blood related or DNA related much more than the Rakhines with the majority Burmans.
Oh.
Yeah. So we know certainly that there have been big movements of population in that area from the east and from the west.
But no. Look, those European countries, they are, tracing back for, French, for the clubs. And the British for so even those European countries recourse to those mythologies. And it's important. For example, I personally feel in this. Just like you said, I was born here, and I go to elementary school, high school, and college here, like everyone here. And then I served in the army, and then I work here, pay tax for that. But I always, still now, in Taiwan, we will confront, particularly in the internet comments, something. Those people should go back to China, something. So never. You said that those things never make my qualification in terms of this course qualified as a Taiwanese. So yeah.
Yeah. Also, in this pre-colonial period, the Southeast Asian region, they have several parallel existing kingdoms. They call it maybe Mandela model. And also people actually move around and they stay there. So, but when the British or this French or this Dutch or Spanish people occupy a certain place, and they, for example, Indochina, right? Originally, they are not necessarily one country. Or, for example, the southern tip of this Thailand. There are so much, the three provinces, they are all Muslim. They are very much connected to the part of the Malaysia. And one of our students, Zikri, he said his mother was from that part, from Thai, but they moved to Malaysia. But they are all relatives. But they became Malaysian instead of Thailand. But Malaysian now is a Muslim country. But the Thai, the three provinces, they were very much oppressed, by the previous the government. It's terrible, right? So they wanted independence, but they could not. So it's all arbitrary. So there's a partition of so-called colony. And then the nation state, okay. So you said the Rohingya, they are less related to the Burma local people, but they mixed around. So
the Rakhines are less related. So the Buddhists to the Buddhists less than the Rakhines and the Rohingya.
All right.
If that's true, I don't know, but like I read a paper like that.
Okay. Right. So
Yeah,
so when you say no, I think how do we really push further? For example, the causes. You said it's a politicization of diversity, right? But we should maybe push further and think how do we theorize so-called politicization of diversity? So there are several levels of reasoning or articulation. It is not only so-called politicization that involves a lot. Right.
But going back to what you said about identity, I believe people should be able to inhabit several identities. I definitely inhabit several identities. And let me tell you a story. So what you said before, like sending all the people back that came to Taiwan in the 50s, I actually, in one of my lectures, I kind of compared the Rohingya to that. Like, can you imagine that now somebody would say that all the people who came in the late 40s, early 50s would go back? This doesn't make sense, right? But what happened to my family, so the German side of my family, after the Second World War, because there was a sizable German minority in today's Slovakia, and they were sent back. But back, how back? I actually have the family tree from the 13th century. And so from the 13th century, those people lived in that certain area that is now Slovakia. They keep their language. So My grandma still went to a German-speaking school. Then she married like a fellow German-speaking person, and of course they spoke Slovak. They even spoke Hungarian because back then it was very fashionable to speak Hungarian. The official language was Slovak, so they spoke these three languages. At home speaking German, and when they were kids they were able to attend these German-speaking schools. After the Second World War, these people are sent back, yeah, but I mean, they have been born there, their grandparents were born there, like all the way back to the 13th century. So my family is actually one of the very few that stayed behind, so they were on some kind of train that went first to Poland and then was supposed to go to Germany, but they were able to bribe some Polish officers with cigarettes to let them get off, and then they walked back to Slovakia. And then they went to some friends and they lived in very terrible conditions, I think, for many years. And they actually had a lot of troubles during communist times because the Russians wanted to make my grandfather, who was a judge, they wanted to make him a spy because he spoke German, so he would have been the perfect spy, right? Well, he refused, and then so he has been kicked out of work, and they had 6 children. One of them, the youngest one, is my mom, and each child was born in a different city. That's because he found a job. A few years later, he was fired because back then you would have the citizenship, which was Czechoslovak citizenship, but his nationality was German, and he tried to change it, but he wouldn't grant him the change. So in his official papers, he was still German nationality, Czechoslovak citizenship, and this caused him lots of problems. So they were moving from one city to another. Yeah. So yeah, and when speaking, and so then my mom, she married my father, who is from the Hungarian minority. Again, that's a minority that speaks Hungarian at home, speaks Slovak outside in the streets, in the schools, and so on. So that's why I say that I definitely inhabit various identities, you know. Like I always introduce myself as a person from Slovakia because this is all way too complicated to explain. But then when I get to talk to someone, I explain this and yeah. So it's actually German, that's my mother tongue, and Slovak is my third language. Well, of course it's my best and strongest language because I went to schools in Slovakia.
Why is Hungary a fashionable language?
Not anymore, but it used to
At
be.
the time.
Austro-Hungarian
Yes.
Empire.
Oh yeah.
And so like
right,
the rich
sure,
people
sure.
were the Hungarian speakers.
Even
so.
Czechs have hang-ups about being Austro-Hungarian.
Really?
Yeah,
You
yeah.
should know that. You've been there.
I didn't know.
But actually,
Yeah.
in the capital city, in Bratislava, you will find lots of the old people speak these 3 languages, German, Hungarian, and Slovak, because that was kind of like, you know, like where all these people mingled, and that was very typical to have these 3 language combinations.
But now you no longer confront examination of your identity, right?
No, and like
Right,
in my documents, you only see that I'm a citizen of Slovakia. I don't need to write down whether I feel as a Slovak, German, or Hungarian.
But here, still, you know, Taiwanese, Chinese are still under examination. So
But you don't have it in the documents. There was a
No.
movement in the 90s for the new Taiwanese identity, which didn't really work out.
Also, your parents' birthplace doesn't show on the ID card, right? The illicit version, so it's all from Taiwan.
Yeah.
One. Just
习惯, yeah.
but this not depends on the.
But still,
ID card.
I
So now you can see, you know, now in a presidential campaign, many those kind of examinations.
I was
still-
just going to speak about the campaign that like I was told that like language is used as one of the things how to distinguish, with apparently the DPP using Taiwanese a lot and the KMT campaigning in Chinese. But I also heard it's not strictly divided because it depends also on the areas.
Okay, one question I will seek maybe your more precise correction of my thought. I offered a course called religious violence, and then in that there's one unit on religious majority and minorities, particularly when the religious majorities are combined with the nationalist movement. So I raised, we have many cases of that in Middle East. You have even sectarian, conflicts or the domination of that. But in terms of Buddhist religious majorities who are violent, and associated with as nationalism, I raise, the Myanmar's case and Sri Lanka's case. And as a case of religious majority associated with the nationalism, is that the precise or not precise enough?
I think in this case, religion is only being used, The thing is, like, I am very often asked, like, how come that Buddhists are these fascist Buddhist monks you hear about? Like, how is that possible? Everybody associates Buddhism with a very peaceful religion and so on. Well, it is because it's not because of the religion. So, Myanmar is a very hierarchical country, much, much more than Taiwan. And I usually compare it to a teacher-student, parent-child, and leader-follower dynamics. So as a child, you listen to your parents, you're not supposed to question your parents. Then you go to school and you never question your teachers, you just accept whatever they say. You grow up and then you have either political or religious leaders, and again, because you are used to not questioning, you simply don't question. And because most of the people are Buddhists, they have their Buddhist leaders and they follow what those leaders say without questioning them. And I think this is the big problem here, not the religion itself.
Okay,
No.
you didn't finish about Sri Lanka though. I want to hear this one.
About Sri Lanka?
No, you didn't finish it. What were you going to say about Sri Lanka?
The Buddhist religious majorities against the Tamil. The Tamils,
Okay.
which is
I guess my turn to be contrarian. Okay. See, I teach a course on nation state. Okay. One theme I persistently pursue all the time is the roots of ethnic conflict are not necessarily ethnic. Okay. Since you mentioned, all right, we're looking at what seems to be an ethnic conflict, what seems to be religious conflict. If you ask me offhand, knowing what I know, which is not very much, I'm very skeptical about whether religion or even ethnicity itself is the root of this conflict of what we're seeing today. Okay, now let me explain. I'm really actually kind of surprised how little we know about the history of this region. And maybe the answers will be hidden in that history. I'll give you an example. Since you mentioned Sri Lanka, I was going to say actually, if you look around the globe, I think the case of violence that mirrors the one that you're talking about most closely is Sri Lanka. Okay, Tamils and Sinhalas. I mean, we all know this. Okay. Anyone who knows of anything about Sri Lanka or has been there will tell you 50 years ago, these two ethnic groups, these two religious groups have been living in peace for centuries. Okay, even as long as 50 years ago, nothing happened. All right, no problem. Why is it that in a matter of a few years that they're trying to kill themselves to death? Okay, to the point of genocide, if you like. All right. That's a big mystery. Okay, so since I'm inviting Bruce Capper here, Bruce Capper actually wrote a very interesting paper about Sri Lanka because he did his research there on religion. And this one paper I use in class, actually his analysis is pointing to a very complex historical situation which begins with colonialism, because the ethnic tensions were not exacerbated by ethnic differences per se, but was a function of colonialism. Okay, you have racial divisions everywhere, okay, Malaysia and so on and so forth. See, also, I say the same thing to my Malaysian students. I say, look, you talk so much about race, you know, Chinese versus Malay, blah, blah, blah. One of the books you really should read is a book by Abraham called The Colonial Construction of Race in Malaysia. We know what ethnic division is like in Malaysia, but people forget that, you know, before Malaysia became what it is today, it wasn't even a nation, okay? It was sultans, you know, even Malay wasn't such a majority ethnic group. Not even Muslims, okay? You had Aboriginal groups, so on and so forth. The whole country was changed by the British. But the British, when they brought over the Chinese and Indians, did not just bring in different ethnic groups. They brought them within a system of economic stratification. The Indians were in the rubber plantations, the business were the businessmen. When you really think about it, if you add on the 50, 60 years or whatever of colonial rule, in the aftermath, you know, you have the basis not of an ethnic divisive society, but the roots of ethnic division is economic. You know, if the Chinese didn't control the economy, you wouldn't have a conflict between the Malays. Have nothing to, you know, to fear or feel threatened. It's the threat that they have, not as an ethnic group, but the fact that they've already dominated the economy in a country which should presumably belong to Malaysia. That's the beginning of Bumiputra, because ethnicity is used as a kind of defense against this kind of situation. So what you're really seeing is not just ethnic division, but the way in which economic stratification has structured the situation. That becomes a prison. See, that's really part of the situation. In Sri Lanka, you have a similar kind of situation. The tensions between the Sinhalas and the Tamils really didn't begin until much later on, after independence, and also have to do with the changing mode of capitalism. Also, that within the state bureaucracy system, certain things happen which manage to structurally divide Sinhalas versus Tamils. So that's part of the complex situation. I kind of see the same kind of situation here, even though I don't know about it too much, because again, you say, okay, the Rohingyas were not granted citizenship. That's part of it, you know. If you start off with being disadvantaged, it's a situation we have no citizenship. That's already, you know, part of the problem. Okay. Now the other thing is that, you know, it's easy for us to look at just the news and the current events and then just look backward. Okay, people fighting. That's usually the thing. And then you say, okay, why are people fighting? I find it kind of hard to believe that, you know, all of this just came about like this, to the point of where you know it's becoming genocide. You see, you may have mass violence, but you know, in order for mass violence to become genocide, in other words, one ethnic group against another ethnic group, other things have to happen. So I can see how, you know, some of it was magnified by the fact that, okay, you have certain extremists attacking the police and that, you know, you have retribution, blah, blah. I don't think that's the end of it. See, but that has a root too. That's why I say, you know, you have to look at it historically. There may be other factors involved, but the fact that, you know, people are only looking at it from the surface and then just guessing the rest and then say, you see, Buddhist, you know, versus not, that's too easy. There's something else here that I don't quite understand. I think it's quite similar to the Tamils. You know, Tamils also were in a similar situation. They're not citizens, but that's part of it. That's part of the exploitation. But a lot of this could have been exacerbated by other things, which are not necessarily ethnic or religion, because, you know, the religion in itself doesn't explain anything. You know, of course, you have Buddhist monks, but then again, well, okay, there might be something to this fascist Buddhist monks too. You know, the fact that it takes on a certain kind of tone, but it's usually within a certain context that it takes this kind of tone. Because in a normal context, people say, okay, I'm a Buddhist, well, big deal. I mean, you know, Buddhists are peaceful. You know, you have Buddhists everywhere. Buddhists in Thailand are peaceful. Why is it that Buddhists in Myanmar are violent? You know, it's there has to be something else here. So I would say, well, I don't know. I'm just sort of curious, but you know, again, the fact that it's hard to study and so on and so forth. It seems to me you have to do that because there's too many things that you know people are not seeing, and it's too easy just to draw your own conclusions about what's happening. You know, so I look at it and say, well, I don't know. I'm not satisfied because I don't know everything. But everything that you see is too easy.
We know that the British, they kind of exacerbated these ethnic divisions, if not even divided people. Like, there I'm a little uncertain. But we know that they favored the Rohingya because they were hardworking over the Rakhines that were regarded as lazy. That has been then, this view has been taken over by the majority population here, so they still consider the Rakhines lazy, just like the British did a long time ago. So
that's usually part of it. I mean, when the British, if the British favored this group for whatever reason, that is part of it. You see, it's not just the ethnic
So just
difference.
like the ethnic Chinese in Malaysia, they are more industrial, clever in business and everything. So the local people will be marginalized. I mean, the hierarchy, and also when they turn Malay, this is really a fabrication, a new construction of the race because of this long history of migration. So, but the problem also is how and when does the violence legitimized and given to certain group of people, and there's no limit. For example, those Buddhist monks, how could they do it? Of course, Rohingya also could do that, but in maybe revenge and something. But the massive killing by the military troops. So the legitimization of violence is supported also by the law of the state. Yeah. So it's an institutionalized crime.
So, but you know that the nation-state part of it is equally messy. I mean,
Sure.
people tend to forget that passports were only invented in the late 19th century.
Or citizenship. I mean, of course, in the colonial period. But this citizenship card, for example, red and blue and the yellow and the white. So how can people be so simply divided into this 3 or 4?
Yeah.
So,
Europe, you have tons of examples of ethnic groups that are like Poles and blah blah blah. They don't become a problem until people start drawing hard lines and say, you see, you have to choose. That's when you have the problems. See, so equally, when the nation state hardens and say you have to have a passport, you have to have you have to be citizen. That's when the boundaries are.
sure.
When you make the boundaries, that's the basis for division and conflict. It's not so much the ethnicity per se or religion per se.
So that also involves who is making the law. Those people, the party, which party? The party that's in power, and primarily the Malay or Indonesia or Burma or Viet, the King people from Vietnam, and then the rest would be, of course. So, yeah.
That's why in Myanmar, so the other ethnicities are a little bit angered by not having enough power, or so in the 2015 elections, the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi's party won the majority. The Rakhine State was the only state where she didn't win majority. It was a Rakhine nationalist party that won in that state. And until last week, it was expected that in the following elections in 2020, the NLD will win less seats, and there will be more ethnic parties that will get seats. Well, I'm not so sure after like this whole ICJ and so on, that might have changed the whole dynamics a little bit. Yeah.
I think what you mentioned here is interesting. It seems that there are lots of these communal-based and ethnic-based political parties in Myanmar. And personally, that would become the major problems. One of the distinctions between Malaysia and Singapore is that in Singapore, no the parties cannot be ethno-based, but in Malaysia,
yeah, right.
at the day when they become an independent state, the major party in the alliance are communal-based
Sure.
parties.
That's Lee Kuan Yew speaking. Okay, that's the difference between the difference between Singapore and everywhere else. It's Lee Kuan Yew who looked at the rest of the world and said, we don't want to do it this way. See, it's too easy. Singapore, 85% Chinese. You divide it along ethnic lines. At most, you get 85%. I want 100%. This is Lee Kuan Yew speaking.
I'm seeing that
But it's not less political than anything else. That's a political calculation too.
Yeah. Right. And also he stabilized his power, right, by his
This
policy.
is Singapore is a
Such a
crazy
long
place, you know, they get less than
time.
60% of the vote, they get very nervous. You know, as in many other places, 60% is a big majority, right? You know, once they get before 75%, they start getting nervous and they start clamping down on opposition. Really crazy. You know, they want 100%. That's Singapore.
Besides rebel riot, is there any other, liberal force who against these kind of
Oh, you have some more to show, right?
Yes, yes. Yes, there are several NGOs that work on all kinds of interfaith projects in Rakhine State and also in other states. In Rakhine State, apparently it's very, very difficult, and those people running this NGO are also facing some kind of violence against them. But still they continue their work. And you have also scholars, I think a very famous one is Maung Zarni. I met him here in Taiwan a few months ago. So he actually comes from a military family, from a Buddhist military family, and he stands up already for many, many years. He's campaigning for the Rohingya people. But most of the people, if you went to Myanmar, let's say now, you would see that most of the people last week were out in the streets rallying with banners saying, "We stand with you, Aung San Suu Kyi." Apparently Facebook was full of those, like those profile picture frames saying, "We stand with you, Aung San Suu Kyi." Big, big rallies. And then you could find very few people who had like little tables and they were there like, "I stand with human rights, come change my mind," or something like that. Yeah, so you have very few people who are on the other side. All right, if you have a few more, yes?
I have one question. Actually, the political part is quite interesting because I don't think Myanmar is peculiar. Okay, now we have all this suspicion about Aung San Suu Kyi. Why is she? The evidence is obvious. Blah 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 blah.
It's very
and she's
political
being
what she's doing
corrupted
now.
by politics. I said, what do you think is happening in the U.S.?
Of course, of course, yeah.
There's so much evidence against Donald Trump. I mean, this guy has, is more criminal than Nixon, but yet people don't support impeachment. Guess what? Everyone's so politicized now. Why are the Republicans supporting Trump? Because they fear losing the election. It's that simple.
Sure.
Same.
Yeah.
Same.
I mean, now, this is for me not even a question why Aung San Suu Kyi doesn't speak out for the Rohingya. Now, at this point, it's very clear because she wants to win the elections.
Yeah.
This is the situation in the country, and she's Bamar, the majority is Bamar.
Yeah.
She wants the support of the people, she wants power, she will not speak up for the Rohingya. why she did not speak up for them, let's say in 2012, where she could have maybe stopped this, that remains an unanswered question to me. All right, and
Yeah.
so this is a short documentary film. It's called Sitwe. Let's not watch it now. We don't have enough time for that. But this is just a suggestion for you. And the second suggestion is this is an 11-minute video. It's called "This is where the Rohingya genocide happened." This is actually a very short documentary clip that captures quite well what is happening. And let me give you some more interesting facts about the country. So we mentioned already the new capital city, Naypyidaw. So it was actually in 2005 that the junta moved it. From one day to another, suddenly you saw a lot of big convoys packed up and going to Naypyidaw. Naypyidaw was like nothing before. Suddenly they created a capital city. And it was named Naypyidaw in 2006. It officially means City of the Kings. I went there in 2010. Nobody wanted to sell me a bus ticket to go there, so I had to go to many these kind of travel agencies and shops. And finally, someone sold me the ticket and said, "But be very, very careful. Don't be very obvious and don't take pictures with a big camera." I didn't have a big camera. And don't take notes. Usually I don't take notes when I travel. So I managed to go. And it was an absolutely empty city, lonely planet, only had one page. It is not advised for foreigners to travel to Naypyidaw. But I was very curious, so I went, and it was absolutely fine. We had a city tour. The city was absolutely empty. There was a huge highway with lights in a country that doesn't have too much electricity or has lots of electricity outages. So it was very interesting to see. Now you have all the diplomats traveling back and forth. When I lived in Myanmar in 2015-16, foreigners were not allowed to rent a room or an apartment in Naypyidaw. They were only allowed to stay there in hotels. In Yangon, foreigners were allowed to rent houses, rooms and apartments if they had business visa. If they had a tourist visa, they were not allowed to do that. So very different rules in different places. So my first time in the country was 2010, before the election, so under the old regime. And back then I had to change money on the black market. But 10 years ago I was a student, and like for me the black market, it sounded very scary. Where do I find the black market? And then
Everywhere.
And then it's very scary. Yes. Well, of course, now I know.
Same thing in Taiwan.
Yeah. Well, but here you had to find the black market, because if not, the official exchange rate for $1 was 6 CHF. At the black market, you would get 1,000 CHF for $1. So, of course, like, it's a crazy difference, so you have to find the black market somehow. But it was very easy. We just went to a regular market, and then me and my friend, we were wondering, like, okay, so now we really have to try to find those black parts of this market. We had no idea what we were talking about. It took 3 minutes of us walking, and someone did I'm going to change money. We're like, yes. And so they took us inside of one shop, and then we exchanged the money there. Now the exchange system, it's a floating exchange system, and it is about 1,500 CHF. Now, and you can exchange it in a bank, you can withdraw money from an ATM. When I went in 2010, there was only one ATM, and that was in Yangon, with that exchange rate, 6 CHF for $1. Obviously, nobody really used that. So you had to bring crisp US dollars and then exchange it. And so then you would end up, this is not so much money, this is maybe $200 US. So yeah. Then when I lived there, you had to pay rent as a foreigner for 1 year up front. But there was so much money, so I literally begged my landlord, like, please, could we do 6 months? Actually, it was fun, like, sure, let's do 6 months up front. And so then I called with my sister, and she's like, but with the money there, will she bring a bag for the rent money? I was like, I don't know, maybe. And she came with a little bag for the money, and then this is how much I paid her. That was the money for 6 months. This is about $6,000 US.
Vietnamese dong.
Yeah. And yeah, this is what I mentioned. So the ATMs, before there were no ATMs, now it's very easy to find ATMs. But there is a limit, so it will not give you more than $300 US, which can be very problematic. And also, a fun fact, the credit cards melt in some ATMs because it's very hot. And because all these ATMs are new, they didn't realize, okay, now they probably know already, they have to place them in a place where there's shadow. Also, they're buying credit cards from China, old credit cards that are not being used anymore, and they're cheap, so this is probably, so the first these bank cards in Myanmar had this melting problem. Then in 2010, I entered Myanmar and didn't use my phone. I went maybe twice in 2 weeks to an internet cafe. It was not censored, so it was fine. But nobody had SIM cards, nobody had cell phones. Only very, very few people, because a SIM card was $5,000 US. Even before that, like, not many people had phones. If you read about the lives of diplomats, so diplomats had phones and they kind of like knew all the phone numbers by heart, because the phone number was 5 or 7 or 10, and you would call to the Swedish embassy and so on. And so in 2010, only the elite had a SIM card because they were so expensive. Then the price dropped to 2,000, to 800, 200, and by the time I moved to Myanmar, it was $2 US. But because some foreigners didn't know about this change, so when people were leaving, they would sell the SIM card. So still, when I arrived, I could see some ads like selling my SIM card for $100 US. And at first I couldn't believe it, because like you go to the street and you buy a $2 SIM card. Why would I spend $100? But the $100 was already a very big discount from the $200 from like the previous times. So anyways, now it's very cheap. It's easily, everybody can buy a SIM card. It's very easy. You can buy it in the street. You have 3 mobile operators, so also the rates are becoming cheaper. There was no Wi-Fi in 2015 and 16, so we had to rely on data that we bought. And then depending on which provider you bought, like in some regions you wouldn't have any network, any signal, so it was a bit problematic. And then I met lots of people who use Facebook, but when I asked them about internet, they said they don't use internet, but they use Facebook. Because it was all very new to them. And yeah, so I had a cleaner who became my very good friend, and I would, once a week she came to our house to clean, and I would teach her, always half an hour before, teach her how to use the internet. So I helped her set up a Gmail account, a Facebook account, and then 2 months later she asked me, so what's the difference between Facebook and Gmail? I was like, okay, here we go again. And I explained, but thanks to that I am in touch with her because we write to each other on Facebook. And let me show you some pictures. So these are Shan people. This is a bus in Yangon, which usually was very difficult for us as foreigners to take the bus, because they would, the bus helpers would scream the destination. Also reading the bus numbers was very difficult until we learned how to read a little bit. Then
You can read.
I was able to, but I forgot everything. Because the thing is, when I left Myanmar, I didn't really have any Burmese friends outside of Myanmar to practice, and Google Translate didn't work. So really, like, I took a lot of classes back then. So I had to rely on my memory, on my notes. And once I was out of the country, I didn't practice it anymore, and I really forgot so much.
Just use Google.
Now it works. Now it works. But back then it didn't. Yeah. So the script is very cute. Lots of circles. And yeah, and it's a syllabic ABC. So you one character is a syllable, not a letter. Okay, so this is when you travel around in some very remote areas where there's no hotels or guest houses, you will sleep in people's houses. This is back in 2010. I actually volunteered and I was teaching in one orphanage school. That was a very interesting experience. This is a regular street in Yangon downtown. One interesting thing, almost all the cars are white in Myanmar. I don't know why. This is another means of transportation. This is kind of a bus. If you're Burmese and you work for a company, this will be your benefit, that the bus will pick you up and drop you off, because the public transportation back then didn't really work. And this was also, this made the ladies feel safe being picked up and being dropped off. Yeah, electricity problems. Lots of electricity outages, and then at some point I was a trainer of former political prisoners. This was for the Swedish Burma Committee, an NGO that operates in the country. And so this was kind of a civic education with various topics. But we wouldn't have electricity very often, which always shocked me. But the students, they just took out some candles out of the bag, lit the candles, and like, as if nothing happened, we just continued. So I was like, wow. These are the huge streets and lanes in Naypyidaw, in the new capital. Not many cars. This is the highway with many lanes, no cars, but with lights. That was something very, very difficult to understand for me. For this we don't have time, but since I'm leaving the PowerPoint here, this is a little bit about other stateless minorities in Asia. And yeah, that's all from me. So thank you very much for your attention.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Test one of my wild idea. During those violence, I was so concerned, and then I think, because there's a showing of those marching and shouting Buddhist monks, so I thought, whether Taiwan's Buddhist leader, like Xing or Zheng, could, just like a pope, address to certain violence in our world. As a Buddhist spiritual leaders of Taiwan could issue certain kind of,
I don't think so, because they're not so powerful like in Myanmar.
The Buddhist is not so much.
The
So
lead-
that's
the lead-
irrelevant.
The leaders have traditionally been very involved in politics. Like you saw the Saffron Revolution in 2007. Who was marching in the streets? The monks. So monks are very involved in politics. I don't see that in. They always have, like definitely from the late 80s. In the 88 uprising, they were also quite prominent there, but then even more in the Saffron Revolution. And I don't see the Buddhist monks in Taiwan being so much involved in politics.
No, you don't know that.
Are they?
Secretly,
I think
that every president or a candidate on whatever level they would need to visit those temples.
Okay,
And
that
because
I
they have
heard.
their
Yes.
followers who would vote. So that they're
So there is a certain
not
influence here
domestic
too.
electoral politics, but world politics. I mean, how.
Or you were saying our monk speaks to the Burmese monks.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, something like that.
That is
That's
actually
what
a
I
very
said.
good idea. So
Yeah.
can you get your Taiwanese monks to speak to the Burmese
Yeah,
monks?
I don't know. I'm not.
No,
a
our
Buddhist.
Taiwanese monks travel around China, right? They had many huge temples, but do they have any influence? No, they don't mess with those local politics,
Yeah.
right?
So that's why I say that's a wild idea.
I like it.
Yeah, right.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, great. But that's 5 minutes fast, by the way. So in case you're
Okay.
looking at the clock, but
Yeah.
it's been a long day for you anyways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for coming and listening to me.
Yeah,
At least we have first-hand information on this.
yeah, right.
So do you want me to copy it to this computer here? Should I do that?
Just leave it if you want. So.
And then you can get it
Yeah,
from here.
Maybe,
Or
let's
you
see.
can also take it from here.